My name is Nicholas. I am one of the naturalists here at the Woodlands Nature Station. This is my flower anatomy webinar. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the different parts of flowers, what exactly are flowers, and why we should care about them beyond just what we already know and love. Now I'm going to try to keep this kind of generalized. I noticed in preparing for this that we've got a wide range of students, everything from early elementary and kindergarten all the way up to, I believe, 10th grade. So I've tried to kind of cover that broad spectrum of what we're going to be covering. Now, just as some fun facts, flowers are one of my favorite things, not just because they're gorgeous, but most of my experience is genetics of flowers. And so this is already kind of a subject that's near and dear to my heart. Another thing, one of the reasons why I actually volunteered to do this program is because not only am I a flower nerd, but I'm also a homeschooler. I was homeschooled throughout most of elementary school and early high school. And all last year started homeschooling my own kiddos. So you guys are my people. And so this is something that I really wanted to do and something that I enjoy doing. So without any further hoo-ha about who I am and why we're all here, let's dive right on in and start talking about flowers. I know I'm going to keep harping on this, but if you guys have any questions at all, please make sure to drop those in the chat or to use that Q&A function, because that's kind of the only way that I get to have back and forth with you guys. So, in any case, let's get going. What do flowers do? What even are flowers? Well, flowers are kind of one of the most important parts of a plant. Now, of course, just about every part of the plant is important, from its roots, which bring up the nutrients out of the soil, to the leaves, which allow them to photosynthesis and make energy. But flowers, if it weren't for flowers, then plants wouldn't be able to continue to spread. We wouldn't ever get new roses. We wouldn't ever get new trees. We wouldn't ever get new plants. We would just get that one generation of plants, and then when they die off, we wouldn't have any more plants. Flowers are the way by which plants move on to the next generation. That's how they make new plants. Now, some fun facts are flowers have been around for eons. There are many, many, many different kinds of flowers, and not all of them look like what you and I would call a flower. Most people, when they think of a flower, they think of beautiful roses or those big brightly colored lilies, maybe even the little yellow daffodils that pop up in the spring. But we all have kind of an idea in our head what a flower looks like. But realistically, there are tons of flowers out there. Everything from the little heads of ears of corn that look like a grass to the little tufts at the end of actual grasses. Those are types of flowers. I've got here on screen, there are over 230,000 known different kinds of flower. And even though many of them look wildly different, sometimes it can be hard to tell exactly what part of the plant you're looking at is the flower, which part is the thing that's actually trying to create pollen and trying to create seed. They all serve the same function, regardless of how weird they look, regardless of what shapes and colors they might have. All of these flowers are there to try and create new plants, to try and get some more interesting genetics through pollination, which we'll talk more about. And they allow these plants to reproduce. So yeah, flowers are the main method by which plants get to reproduce and make the next generation of plants, which is pretty awesome. Right. Don't have any questions so far. So continuing along with what exactly flowers do, I mentioned that these are the way by which plants reproduce. This is the way by which plants beget more plants. Now, the way that this works is that first the plant grows and matures, and then it blooms into its flowers. And then after that flower is pollinated, after this flower receives pollen from a different flower, then the pollen and the flower in question can now create seeds. And one of the main ways by which they create these seeds is through some kind of fruit. Now, when I say fruit, I don't just mean like strawberries. I mean any kind of fruiting body that the plant produces. Now, many of the time, these are actual things that you and I would eat. Tomatoes, and in this reference, in this definition of fruit, are a fruit. But even corn, even though we know corn is a vegetable, corn is the fruit of that particular plant. That is how the flowers of those corn stalks have developed into some kind of body by which it can. And so, of course, in my example here, I've got tomatoes. People like tomatoes. And what would happen in nature if we didn't pluck them off the vine and then eat them is that big old fruit filled with all those seeds would eventually get to the point where it would fall off of the host plant, would fall off of the plant in question, or more likely would be taken away by some kind of mammal, some kind of animal that is then going to eat the fruit and distribute the seeds along the way, somewhere away from the host, somewhere away from the plant that the fruit came from, because you don't always want your seeds to fall down right around your roots, because then any of those seeds are now going to have to compete with you for resources. You don't want that. That's kind of like if mom and dad constantly fought for your dinner. You wouldn't want that. And neither did the plants. That's not a very successful way to reproduce. It's not a very successful way to get the next generation up and going. And so oftentimes these fruiting bodies, these fruits, are kind of scheduled to a way to where birds, mammals, and various kinds of bugs, some delivery method by which to get those seeds. Once the flower goes into the fruit stage, the seeds are now distributed by wind. If you guys know those little helicopters, those are actually blown away, and that's how those get moved around. But it all starts with that flower. It all starts with that flower trying to get pollen from another flower of a similar tree or bush or a similar plant, same species plant, but a different individual. You want to get pollen from one individual and a flower from the second individual, because that keeps all the genetics interesting. That allows those plants to be the healthiest that they can possibly be. Although there are some trees, there are some bushes, there are some plants where one flower here and another flower here on the exact same plant can pollinate one another. There's all kinds of ways by which nature makes it work. Now, we're not going to go a whole lot more in depth about how all that works. We're going to start talking more about pollination. What exactly is pollination? Because that's kind of the main thing that flowers are here for. That's kind of the main thing that flowers are trying to do, is pollinate. So the way by which pollination works, I mentioned that a minute ago, is some mechanism. Sometimes it's wind, sometimes it's bugs, sometimes it's birds. There's tons of different pollinators out there. We'll move pollen from one plant to another plant. We'll move pollen from one flower to another flower. Of course, in my example here, it's a bumblebee. Now, of course, the flower needs to make it worthwhile to the pollinator. The pollinator's not just going to wander by and randomly collect pollen and distribute it to the next few flowers. If the pollinator, in this case the bee's not getting anything out of it. So oftentimes flowers, beautiful bright colors, attract these pollinators. Things like hummingbirds are attracted to bright red flowers. Things like bumblebees are often attracted to various blues and purples. Butterflies are attracted to a wide variety of different colors, depending on the kind of butterfly you're talking about. Things like wind-pollinated plants, they often don't have very pretty, colorful flowers, like the sycamore tree. Its flowers are just really small and drab and green. You and I wouldn't call it a flower, but that's because it's wind-pollinated. There's no reason for it to be brightly colored. It's not trying to attract a pollinator. It's going to chuck all of its pollen out into the wind and hope for the best. But also, not just the brightly colored things, but many, many, many different kinds of flowers offer some kind of nectar. They offer some kind of sweet treat to attract things like bees and butterflies and hummingbirds. really any kind of pollinator as kind of a reward. And so it the bee, the pollinators are just stopping by for a meal. They're just stopping by to get some of that junk food, some of that sweet little nectar. And then while they are stuck on the flower, while they're sitting there getting at the little nectary, the flowers are often shaped in such a way where as the bee is climbing into the flower to get to the nectary, the parts of the flower that make the pollen actually are leaning over and hitting the various fuzzy parts of the bee, or they're getting stuck to the legs of the bee. So that the bee oftentimes either doesn't realize or doesn't care that they're getting covered in little pollen, kind of like how you and I get covered in Cheeto dust every time we eat Cheetos. And then as the bee tired of having this nectar, or if the little nectary runs out of nectar, then the bee will move on to the next flower. And as he stops at the next flower to get that nectar, he now distributes, he loses some of that pollen onto this next flower. And so he's already done the pollination. Of course, the bee, he's just stopping by and getting snacks. He's not actually doing anything. And so oftentimes the flower and whatever pollinator you're talking about kind of cohabit. They work together so that the flower is better able to get pollen on the bee or on the pollinator, and the pollinator often gets something out of the exchange as well, like nectar, which is pretty cool. And oftentimes, when scientists start describing flowers and start really talking about the nitty-gritty of what part of this flower does what, it is almost always related to or connects with what is pollinating that flower. What is this flower trying to attract as a pollinator? I love flowers too. Flowers are one of my favorite things. I can talk about this all day, but I'm going to try to keep this conversation down to about 40 minutes or so. Okay, so here are just a couple of examples of common flower shapes. I would not have time today or next couple of days, all week. If I took all week to only talk about the different kinds of flowers, we'd still be here a week later. So I've kind of just tried to distill this down to showing you some of the different flower shapes. Each of these different shapes you see here is trying to attract a different kind of pollinator. And there are as many different kinds of pollinators as there are kinds of flowers. But these are some of the just kind of basic shapes that you might see out in nature. And I want to kind of start getting your brains thinking about, how is this shape useful? How would this particular kind of structure help the flower get its pollen to another flower, or maybe onto a pollinator, and then that pollinator get it to another flower? And it gets really interesting really quickly. And then, of course, I'm sure if you guys are anything like me, you've already kind of looked through the list here and gone, well, I like that shape. That's my favorite kind of flower. And so I kind of wanted to just ask you guys right off the bat, who likes what out of all of these shapes? My personal favorite are the trumpet shapes or the funnel shapes. Really, really like those. My daughter's favorite are the pom-poms, which shouldn't be any surprise because she really likes cheerleading and ballet. Anything frilly and pom-pom shape. You like funnel and rosette. Rosette is always a good one. Ooh, rosette and star. Now, as you guys are picking out your favorites, I want you to be thinking, what would this shape help? What would this shape, what kind of pollinator would look at this shape and be attracted to it, would be interested in it? It sounds like you guys might already be like pollinators as far as like, ooh, that's a nice flower, but that one's not so nice. You might already be thinking like your own kind of pollinator. And rosette, very cool. All right. Do we have any questions so far? Looks like nothing on the Q&A. Very cool. Okay. So from here, now that you guys are already kind of starting to think about flower shapes, now that you guys are kind of starting to think about pollination and how the structure of a flower might help in getting us to a particular kind of pollinator, let's play a game. I love trying to teach playing games. It works really well for my 6-year-old. It also works well for this 30-year-old as far as if you can make it fun, if you can make it interesting, it's going to stick a lot better. So Let's play a game. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a flower, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about these kinds of flowers. I'm going to show you some of the coolest flowers in the world, and I want you to try and figure out what would pollinate that. Now that we've talked a little bit about pollinators, now that we've talked a little bit about flower shapes, I want to see if you guys can guess what would pollinate this. Okay? We all ready? Think so? You see bees pollinating these little flowers? Yeah, okay. Let's start with these trumpet creepers. These trumpet creepers are found all over Tennessee and Kentucky. They're a bright orange trumpet-shaped flower. Ooh, we've already got a guess for hummingbirds. Now, some of your ideas, as far as guesses I'm going to lean you towards, there's birds, bees, butterflies, ants, beetles. All of these different things are pollinators, but which one of those do you think are this flower pollinator with this long orangish, yellowish, tubular shaped flower? What kind of pollinator do you think this flower is looking for, is trying to get the attention of? Okay, it looks like we've got several votes for hummingbirds and bees. Okay. Does anybody have any other ideas? Mostly hummingbirds and bees. Nobody thinks butterflies. Nobody thinks beetles. Nobody has a random idea, like maybe a cat. That's a guess. That's an idea. Give it another second. These are one of my absolute favorite flowers that you can find all around here. There are several different kinds of trumpet-shaped flowers. Trumpet Creeper is one of my favorites because I don't really have to do much. Now that I have Trumpet Creeper started in my yard, most of what I do in the summer is trying to calm my Trumpet Creeper down. So it's a very prolific flower. It likes to grow everywhere. Okay. So for everyone who guessed hummingbirds, you guys were absolutely correct. Now, bees and butterflies certainly can pollinate Trumpet Creeper. Certainly can. But the primary goal, the primary thing that those trumpet creepers are trying to attract are hummingbirds. That long tubular shaped flower is perfect for that hummingbird beak. And then the orangish, reddish, yellowish colors, those are all colors that tend to attract hummingbirds. Particularly like our little ruby-throated hummingbirds, they like to go after those red and yellow colors, kind of like how you and I like to go after McDonald's arches. Big red sign, big yellow arches. Yeah, it works on us and it works on our hummingbirds. They really like those bright reddish, yellowish colors. And so those trumpet creepers are specifically trying to attract hummingbirds. Now, it just so happens that here in our neck of the woods, we only have one kind of hummingbird. We only have the ruby-throated. So as a scientist, I can say with confidence, if you have a trumpet creeper in Kentucky, it's trying to attract ruby-throated hummingbirds. Now, what's also really cool about this is that if you see on my picture here with our little female hummingbird getting her beak up into the flower, if you look at that trumpet, if you look at where that red flower kind of narrows down and comes back in and starts turning green, right there where that flower starts to turn green and is a part of the stem, that's where the nectar is. That's where the little bit of nectar is. And so this hummingbird with that really long beak has to get that beak way up into that tube and then stick the tongue out to get to the little bit of nectar that's down at the base of that tube. However, if you notice on that same red flower that this hummingbird is sticking their mouth into, there's a little black antennae looking thing, a little black thread that comes out and it's got a big yellow dot. That is where the pollen is. And so as these hummingbirds get their face right up into the tubes of these flowers, their beak all the way down into the base of the tube, those little, it's called an anther, that's the little stem of the flower, that's the part of the flower that has the pollen on it. That's going to run into the chin or all around the base of the beak of the hummingbird, right there in all those little soft, tiny feathers. That's where that pollen's going to start getting trapped. And so as the hummingbird uses the trumpet and moves on to the next trumpet, then it's spreading that pollen from flower to flower, which is pretty neat. But you can kind of see how the shape of this particular flower helps it in getting pollen onto a hummingbird specifically. And that's not to say that like a bee couldn't crawl all the way back up in there. Or, certain kinds of butterflies might be able to wedge themselves and get down in there, but specifically, this is going to be a hummingbird plant. Anyway, very cool. Good guesses, everyone. You are all doing really great. Now I'm going to throw you guys a curveball. Now we're going to do. This is one of the largest flowers on the planet. It's called the Reflexia Flower, although some places also call it the corpse flower because oftentimes they're really, really stinky. Oftentimes they just don't smell good. This is not one that you and I would necessarily call a flower. I mean, it's definitely got the flower shape, but it kind of looks like an oversized mushroom and less like an actual flower. But it is actually a flower. These things are native to Indonesia. And like I said, they are the biggest flowers on the planet. There's a particular kind of Reflexia. They get to be almost 4 feet from one side to the other side. 4 feet. I'm only like 5.5 feet tall. This flower is almost as big as I am, which is humongous. The biggest one that they ever found was 22 pounds. Yeah, 22 pounds of flower. Crazy. Anyway, so now my question to you guys is, what is going to pollinate something that big? You probably would want like a big pollinator, right? Big flower, big pollinator. Do you guys think it's bees? Do you think it's hummingbirds? Do you think it's butterflies? I don't know. Do you have any bigger ideas? Do you think maybe it could be people? Do you think maybe it could be some kind of large animal? Bears, beetles. I don't think they have bears in Indonesia. Pretty sure they don't. There, I have no idea. I'm not an Indonesian scientist. A couple of people are thinking beetles. You guys don't think it would take a really big pollinator. You guys are thinking it might take a smaller one. Ooh, moles. Moles an interesting one because these flowers, being 22 pounds, do tend to grow near or on the ground. So a mole. Ooh, spiders is an interesting guess. Spiders might like to hide down into that crevice that's in the middle of the flower. That'd be an interesting one. That was mildly terrible. Anyway, okay, we've got lots of interesting guesses. Okay. Are we all ready? Oh, we think a squid. Oh, it's not squid. I misread that. A squirrel. Squirrel. I can see how a squirrel could potentially be a pollinator. I think that's a really interesting guess. Okay. Are we all ready for the correct answer? I think we're ready. The biggest flower in the world pollinated by flies. Carrion flies specifically. Little ones. Yeah, really small flies. I mentioned that it's got a really stinky smell. Flies are attracted to that smell, much like they might be attracted to a corpse, which is why one of the reasons that people call it a corpse flower. Now, I'm going to go back just a second. If you notice, inside the center of that big ring on the flower, there's all those little spines, all those little spikes. Yeah, that's where a lot of the stinky smell comes from. It's right on that little circle on the inside of the flower. And all those little like barbs pick up, that's where all the pollen is. So as the flies are attracted to that stinky smell, they'll fly down and then they'll land on that little plate and they'll just wander around trying to figure out where the smell is coming from, trying to figure out what is here that they might want. And as they wander around, they brush against those barbs and all the little hairs on the top and outside of the fly get covered in pollen. That is a great question, Jamil Clark. It is not a fly trap. It's not actually trapping the flies. The flies aren't stuck. They fly down into the little cup, but they're not stuck. They're just by the smell. And as they wander around in there, they get covered in bits of pollen. But then shortly not too long after this, they realized there's not actually anything here except for the stinky smell. And so the fly will fly out and move on. And then it'll do this to several flowers. And along the way, it ends up transferring that from one flower to another flower. And so in this particular example, these carrion flies don't actually get anything out of it. They're not getting nectar. They're not getting some sweet treat. It's a complete trick. They just get the stinky smell. They stop by to investigate. They get covered in pollen. They move on with their life. And then it happens again and again and again, which is really funny. I think it's funny. But I do find it really interesting. The largest flower in the world is pollinated by a relatively small. I find that fascinating. Anyway, okay. Here's a fun thing to note about these. We actually used to think for a long time that these Reflexia flowers, these huge flowers, were pollinated by elephants. Yep, we thought that the biggest flower in the world also had the biggest pollinator in the world. Because, and this is where scientists had that idea, we constantly found pollen from these big flowers on the feet of elephants. And that left a lot of scientists scratching their head as far as why would one of these elephants be interested in the flower? Maybe the stinky smell was also attracting the elephants. They hadn't quite figured out the relationship between an elephant and a flower, as far as trying to figure out, and particularly like the feet of an elephant. Why would they just accidentally trample them? There were all kinds of ideas where scientists were trying to explain how pollen from this flower ending up on elephants. Well, it turns out that the flies, the particular kinds of flies in question, the carrion flies, are also a common parasite for elephants. So they would stop off at these flowers, they'd get tricked by these flowers, and then somewhere along the way, they would actually find an elephant, and then they could parasitize the elephant. But while they're on the elephant, they leave some of the pollen on the elephant. And so I find this to be absolutely fascinating how all this worked out. It kind of shows off to you guys how scientists kind of put the dots together. We found big flower. Now we found pollen from big flower on elephants. That doesn't make any sense. And they kept looking and they kept investigating, and that's when we found the little flies that were making trips between flowers to flowers and between flowers and elephants, which is really cool. Okay, now that we've covered one really large flower, we're going to talk about another really large flower. This is the giant water lily. It's the largest lily in the world. And these lilies are strong enough, like they sit on the top of the water, the big lily pads do. They sit on the water, and they are strong enough that like a human could sit on the lily pad and it wouldn't sink, which is crazy to me. These things are found down in the Amazon, not surprisingly, one of the biggest forests. Oh, we already got a guess on some pollinators. Yeah, you guys already knew where I was going with this. What do you think pollinates these guys? Got a guess for frog, which is an interesting guess because we all know that frogs like to hang out on lotus and lily pads. Great environment for them. That's an interesting guess. We know that it's a really big bright flower. It's also got lots of yellow going on in there. All right, we think bees. And then, of course, this is the Amazon. There's tons of different kinds of animals down there. Could be birds, could be beetles, could be ants, could be frogs, could be mosquitoes. Ooh, we're thinking really small. Could be something larger. I don't know. Lots of, oh, looks like we're getting a lot of guesses for beetles. All right. Butterflies and frogs. All right. Any other guesses? I notice nobody thinks wind, even though it's out on the middle of a lake. Wind could come through and blow all the pollen away. Then again, it is brightly colored. We did already talk about how brightly colored plants are trying to attract something. You don't really have to attract wind. You guys are thinking. I like that you guys are thinking. All right. Ooh, fish? That'd be interesting. That would be really interesting, wouldn't it? I like the way you guys are thinking. All right. You guys ready? You guys ready for the answer? Okay. Beetles. You guys got it absolutely correct. They're trying to attract beetles. However, here's the really cool thing about these flowers. When I found out about these, it was a lot. Not only do these big beautiful flowers bloom at night, which is already strange, it's already interesting, but they only bloom for 3 days. And on the first day, they start out white. I'm gonna jump back over to this picture here. They start off as this white flower that I've got up in the corner. And when they are that white flower, they've got kind of a really, really sweet smell, like butterscotch and pineapple mixed together. Really, really strong sweet smell. And so that's the whole first day. They're this bright white flower with this really sickly sweet smell. That is what attracts various kinds of beetles. And then as those beetles land in the very center of the flower where all that smell is coming from, after it gets a couple of beetles in there, this one is kind of like a trap, kind of like a Venus fly. The flower will then close, trap the beetles inside the center of the flower. It'll hold them hostage and it will kidnap for an entire day. And it will hold those beetles hostage in the center of the flower. And in the meantime, while it's holding those beetles hostage, lots of things happen. First, and kind of the most important, is that flower starts producing a lot of pollen right there on the inside of the flower, just completely coating the beetles in pollen. While that is happening, the flower also changes colors. It starts shifting from that white flower that you see up in the corner to the kind of reddish, pinkish, purplish flower that you see on the big picture here. And that all happens between the first day and the end of the second day. At the end of the second day, that flower then calmly opens and frees the beetles. It releases its hostages, which are now completely covered in pollen. And the flower no longer has a smell. It no longer smells sickly sweet anymore. Big, bright flower. And the beetles move on and more than likely get tricked by several of these flowers in sequence, distributing all that pollen as it goes. And that bright pink flower no longer has a smell, which means it's not going to be tricking any other beetles. And for me, like I said, this was just a huge surprising thing as far as this is a flower that instead of trying to attract like the hummingbirds do, where it provides some kind of nectar, it actually holds its pollinators hostage. It captures them and just hangs on to them for a little bit. And the beetles don't get anything out of it. They get a safe place to stay for the night, and they get completely covered in pollen along the way. And then, like I said, after the end of the third day, this flower wilts. It's done its thing. It's going to start going to fruit and start going to seed. It's already gotten its whole pollination done in just 3 days. Pretty crazy. Pretty cool. Anyway, giant water lily. I wholeheartedly recommend you guys look that up. Moving right along. What about agave? Now, agave is a desert plant. The actual plant itself has those big, thick, broad leaves, kind of like a cactus, but it's not exactly a cactus. Big, chewy, chunky leaves. But it's got these big, beautiful, like tall, stacked blooms. This is the actual flower of the agave, which again, I don't know about you guys, but to me, that doesn't really look like a flower. That doesn't really think what I would call a flower. If you like roses or lilies, or even like those trumpet things that we saw earlier, or like big pom-pom style thistles. This agave doesn't really look like any of those things. We've already got a guess for birds. That's an interesting guess because, of course, it's very tall. It's out in the middle, it's got some height on it, so it knows that whatever it's trying to attract is probably there. But what do you think would be out in the desert? What kinds of animals do you think you could find in really dry, deserty kinds of places where these flowers are going to be growing? Bees. Bees is always a safe guess. Bees are one of our biggest pollinators. That's always an interest. That's a safe guess. Ooh, Lisa Ward thinks bats. Now that's an interesting one. That's an interesting guess. What about the rest of you? Do you guys think that bats could be a good pollinator? Kind of like a bird, except it'd be like a nighttime bird. That's a good guess. Nobody's thinking like lizards or I can't think of what else would be out. Moths. Moths could be a good one. Got another one for squirrels. Scorpions. Scorpions would be an interesting one. I don't know about you guys, but I would not want to find a scorpion in a flower. Okay. All right. Are we ready? You are absolutely correct with bats. It actually makes me really happy to see somebody got that one in the guess. Bats are the pollinators of this beautiful desert plant. This one, the little blooms do offer little bits of nectaries, little bits of nectar there. And the bats, because those blooms are those huge, tall, high, stacked kinds of blooms, it's very easy for bats to get right up in there. If you notice, particularly on this picture on the far side, it's almost like the blooms are kind of on these branches, these outset branches. So that way the bat doesn't have to get very close to the plant in order to actually get from one to the other. But the other thing you might notice is that each of these kinds, there's a couple of different kinds on the picture here. The little green thing or the little bit of white at the base of that is where nectar is. That's where the little bit of treat for the bat is going to be. In both of these examples, in the one in the main center here, where I've got my text, I've got this little spike with a little crossbar on it, and that's a whole bunch of pollen. The idea there being, and you can actually see some on this picture of the bat, where it's on all the fur, all on his face, as he leans in to get his nose close enough to stick his tongue down into the nectary, that little pollen bar, that anther, is going to be hitting him in the face. It's going to be getting pollen on all the fur on his face. The other one, with the white, almost cup-like flowers, kind of trying, almost like a spoon, trying to tell the bat, yeah, okay, the nectar's down here. It's got those pink little spurs come way, way out there, way away from the plant. It's got that little tuft of pollen on it for the exact same reason as the bat is fluttering around and getting down into the nectary. Those little anthers are going to be bouncing around and they're going to be dropping pollen all on the fur of the bat. And it's going to do the same thing from one flower to the next flower, which is really cool. If it weren't for these bats pollinating agave, we wouldn't have agave syrup. It's one of my favorite kinds of syrup. It's one of my favorite things to sweeten my sweet tea with. I know some people might not like that idea, but it's true. Anyway, this one is really cool. I think so. Anyway, again, I'm really happy that somebody got bats on this one. What about squash? There are bunches of different kinds of squash, but every single kind of squash, the kind of squash that you would like to eat in some kind of soup, to pumpkins. Pumpkins are one of my favorite fall things. We're just now starting to aim towards fall, so I had to include this one because fall and pumpkin pie, I mean, come on, guys. So what do you think pollinates squash? Like I said, there's dozens of different kinds of squash, but they all share the same kind of pollinator. Already got a guess for bee. Bees. Spiders. Okay. Nobody's thinking butterflies. Nobody's thinking moths. Going back to flies. Thinking flies. Okay. All right. Go ahead. Dive right on in. It's bees. Yep. I wasn't going to talk about flowers and I wasn't going to talk about pollinators and not mention bees. guys got it. But particularly, it's called a squash bee. These little squash bees are responsible for pollinating almost every single kind of squash that's out there. Yeah, if it's a kind of squash and it's grown around here, it's squash bees. So if you guys like pumpkin pie, if you guys like pumpkin flavored anything, if you like having really any kind of squash, I love having squash in various soup. You have bees to thank for that. Squash bees are one of many different kind of bees. Most of the time when people think of bees, we think of like honeybees. We think of the big nest building bees. These guys are one of several different species. There's dozens of different species of bees that are more solitary. They tend to hang out kind of by themselves. Oftentimes in the winter, these guys are tucking up underneath dried leaves that have fallen to the ground. And so these guys don't have those big nests. And if we don't properly winterize our gardens, or if we're spraying lots and lots of pesticides, these are one of the many different kinds of native bees that are going to get hit really hard by that, particularly when you consider that squash is one of our big commercial crops. That's one of the things that people are often planting in their farm fields. And we want to be careful because we need these bees to pollinate our squash plants. And so this is one that's definitely worth talking about. This is definitely one that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a big pumpkin pie fan, and I definitely want to take care of these little guys. Okay, so this was kind of just a snapshot of some of the different kinds of pollinators that we have. Start sharing that. There we go. Thank you guys for playing that game with me. Now, like I said at the very beginning of all of this, I took the time to talk about every single kind of flower that's around, we'd be here for weeks, and we still probably wouldn't cover everything that's out there. And like I said at the very beginning, it's kind of impossible to talk about flowers and flower shapes without talking about the pollinators and the different kinds of things that they're trying to do and the ways that flowers kind of reward those. And so again, I just did like a tiny snapshot of kind of the biggest ones in the world and a couple of ones that are local and near and dear to at least my heart, and I hope to your guys too. But there are tons of other examples of really cool things. We actually have a kind of plant around here, the pawpaw. That one is also fly pollinated. These little brownish black flowers that hang upside down. You got the branch of the pawpaw and the flower hangs upside down, and it's got kind of a stinky smell. There are trees in Madagascar which are lemur pollinated. Lemurs. And in that particular example, the flower has this sweet smell that attracts the lemurs. The lemurs come, get some of the nectar, and they get the pollen on them, move on. Later on, when that flower develops into a fruit, the lemurs will go and eat the fruit. And then, as the seeds make it through the other side of the lemur is usually somewhere else, at which point the seeds get distributed by the lemur as well. And so that's another example where the flower and the pollinator cohabitate and work together. And in that particular case, through the entire plant's life cycle. That one is the traveler's tree. That's almost entirely dependent upon the black and white bird lemur. Those two go hand in hand. The lemur needs the trees for food, and the tree needs the lemurs for pollination and seed distribution. And like I said, there's tons of different examples, dozens of different examples of ant-pollinated plants down in the Amazon. Most of the plants that we have around here are going to be things like moths, hummingbirds, butterflies, bees. These are a big one. Those are a lot of the plants that we have here the southeastern United States. But like I said, we've also got a few other examples. There's even some orchids that are pollinated by mosquitoes. Right? Mosquitoes are also a potential pollinator. There's tons and tons of stuff out there. And I just wanted to take a little bit of time to kind of give you guys a little bit of a snapshot of all that. We've only got a few more minutes together, so do you guys have any questions for me about anything at all that we've covered so far? You guys have been an absolutely fantastic group. I really appreciate you guys' participation in the chat, and I really appreciate you guys and a lot of your ideas. Really happy that somebody got them. Yeah. If you guys have any questions about any of these flowers? Do spiders pollinate? David Mellot, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I actually have no idea. I really love that guess, and I'll tell you the honest truth, I don't know of one right off the top of my head, but shortly after we're done here, I'm gonna Google that. I'm gonna look that up because surely to goodness, there's probably one somewhere on this wide, wonderful, beautiful planet of ours where a spider could be a pollinator. I just don't happen to know of one off the top of my head. Stephanie, there definitely are ant-pollinated plants. I know of a couple of them. I don't remember them all by name, but I know there's a few of them down in South America, down in the Amazon. There's huge diversity of ants down there. And so there's definitely several plants down there that are ant-pollinated. Very good. Thank you, Miss Lisa Ward. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. You guys have any other questions? Anything at all you'd like to know more about as far as what we talked about? Frogs. There are some goodness, trying to remember. I think it's also in the Amazon. It's been in Indonesia. There is a frog pollinated plant. I cannot for the life of me remember what it's called, but I remember the way that it works. And what it is the flower is shaped like a cup, and that cup holds in little bits of rainwater, and it creates a perfect little home, perfect little environment for the frogs to kind of take shelter. And the way that that one works is while the frog is in the little cup and in the little shelter, it's getting covered in little bits of pollen. And then the strategy is that that frog may or may not come back to the same flower for shelter night after night. And I want to say that was in the Amazon. I can't remember the name of that one off the top of my head. Cool. Thank you guys. The giant Reflexia plant, that one is not poisonous. It certainly looked like it should be. I agree. But no, that one's just got a really stinky smell. As far as pom-poms, a lot of the big purpley frilly pom-poms, some of them are bee pollinated, like our passion flowers. That's one that we have around here. That one's pollinated by carpenter bees. But then those are also fairly popular with all of our different kinds of butterflies. Some different kinds of pom-pom flowers are also moth pollinated, which is a big one. Like well, this one's not pom-pom shape, but like the big yucca plant that we have around here, that one's moth pollinated, which is really cool. Right. Thank you guys. Thank you guys for joining my webinar here. Thank you guys for listening to me rant about flowers. Thank you guys for all of your wonderful participation and wonderful questions. I'm going to hang out for another minute or two if you guys have anything else you want to ask me, but I think this is kind of the official end of the webinar. If you guys got some other things you got to get going to. Again, thank you for joining me on this.